Historical background.
Prior to the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, the Somali coast offered little attraction to the European countries. It was only Britain, which had secured anything resembling a permanent foothold on a small coastal strip opposite the Gulf of Aden, and, even then, its sole motive was to secure essential provisions such as meat, grain, and hay for the British garrisons at Aden. The situation, however, changed drastically following the opening of the canal, which event established the shortest route via the Gulf of Aden to the Far East, for the maritime powers. France, Germany, and Italy started to scramble for analogous spheres of influence all along the Somali coast, and Britain took steps to consolidate and even expand its own sphere of influence. In pursuit of these objectives, Britain sent Lieutenant Col F.M. Hunter in the 1880s to sign treaties with various ethnic groups on the coast, stipulating British protection and prohibiting them from ceding any part of their respective territories to any other power. In 887, British acquisitions were duly notified to the signatories of the Berlin Agreement and consolidated into the Somali Coast Protectorate. The Government of India, through its residency in Aden, took charge of the Protectorate until 1896, where the Foreign Office took over. The latter was responsible for giving the Protectorate its defined boundaries and changing its name to British Somaliland Protectorate. British Somaliland Protectorate occupied a mere 68,000 square miles out of a total of square miles of the Somali inhabited area of the Horn of Africa. It lay between 8 and 12 north of the equator and was bounded by the Gulf of Aden to the north, flanked by the Italian Somaliland colony to the east, by Ogaden to the south and by French Somaliland to the west. The area covered by the Protectorate is very dry and arid, with an average rainfall of 3 inches. The history of the British Somaliland Protectorate between 1899 and 1920 is dominated by the anti-colonial movement of leader of Somali liberation Dervishes, Sayyid Mohamed Abdulle Hassan, known in Europe by the derogatory epithet of the Mad Mullah. Within this period, Great Britain was preoccupied with the task of devising policies, which might lead to the downfall of Sayyid Mohammed's movement. These included limited military action, diplomacy, full-scale expeditions, partial occupation of the interior, coastal administration and finally aerial bombardment. This video deals with one of these phases, the phase of the Camel Corps, which was conceived and inaugurated in 1912. It turned out to be the most disastrous of all the policies hitherto experimented, and it ended up with the humiliation of British forces at Dul Madobe in August 1913. Thus, the Dul Madobe encounter was one of the isolated cases in the history of colonial Africa when Bellu's dictum to the effect that whatever happens we have got the Maxim gun and they have not, didn't hold well. It took the British another good 7 years before the Maxim gun compelled respect, obedience, humiliation and subjection. Between 1901 and 1904, Britain sent 4 military expeditions against Sayyid Mohammed's forces, the Dervishes. The first expedition consisted of 50 Punjabis and 1,500 levies. Its assignment was to capture or kill Sayyid Mohammed. After several engagements, which ended inconclusively, the British realized they had underestimated the strength of Sayyid Mohammed's resistance. The second and third expeditions, though organized on a grander scale, did not fare much better. As for the fourth expedition, Britain's plans were massive and elaborate. It recruited 6,000 troops from India, and borrowed several KAI units from different colonies. The expedition, under the general command of Major General Egerton, cornered Sayyid Mohammed's forces at Jidbul and defeated them, but did not manage to capture Sayyid Mohammed. The latter took refuge at Ilig, in the Italian colony, and established garrison. In 1905 Sayyid Mohammed, the Italians and British signed what came to be known as the Ilig Agreement, which stipulated, inter alia, that Sayyid Mohammed would be treated as a sovereign and that peace would prevail between the 3 parties. It soon transpired, however, that Sayyid Mohammed had only wanted time to recuperate. Within a few months, he was attacking British positions in the Protectorate. Britain was at a loss to know how to deal with such a warrior. Towards the end of 1905 Britain was so totally fed up with its protectorate that it decided to vacate the interior in order to concentrate on the coast, which was a vital source of supplies for Aden. The rest of the protectorate must look after itself, with the help of a few rifles supplied to the tribes, which were not hostile to Britain. Winston Churchill, then Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for the Colonies, was for total evacuation since he could not see any future for the British in that region, but the Colonial Office prevailed upon him to settle for the policy of coastal administration. By 1908 Syed Mohammed's Dervish warriors, taking advantage of Britain's weakened position in the interior, was at the peak of their power and was, in fact, threatening the British administration on the coast. It was unrealistic for Britain to imagine it could be left in peace at the coast while the interior came under the sway of the Dervishes. Britain was thoroughly vexed. In 1909, the Colonial Office sent Sir R. Wingate, the Governor-General of the Sudan, to Somaliland to study the situation and recommend a policy to be adopted by the British government. Although Wingate recommended the reoccupation of some vital points in the interior, the British government was already uncompromisingly committed to the policy of coastal concentration. Thus, Wingate's recommendations were ignored. Between 1911 and 1912, Britain's position on the coast became untenable. The Syed Mohamed issued several ultimates to the effect that if the British did not withdraw altogether from the coast he would drive them into the sea. Yet Britain could not possibly abandon the coast, which was supplying the Aden garrisons with essential supplies. Apart from that, Britain's prestige, internationally as well as locally, could have been dealt a blow had it to evacuate under those circumstances. Some formula, which would neither involve Britain in another full-scale war with the Dervishes nor result in complete withdrawal, had to be found. It was in the context of this historical background, a dilemma as to what to do with British Somaliland, that the idea of a Camel Corps was conceived.
Creation of Camel Corps against the Dervishes.
At the beginning of 1912 the Governor of the Protectorate, Horace Byatt, wrote a long memorandum pointing out the flaws and dangers of the policy of coastal administration with a few scattered armed encampments of the pro-British tribes in the hinterland. He wrote,
"The policy now in operation has disappointed expectations. It has been given a complete trial and it has failed. It is leading to a steady diminution of government's prestige and it promises a worse condition of affairs in the future than at present. The commercial possibilities of the country are not capable of further development, and therefore, the decision as to the future must depend chiefly upon consideration of political expediency, but the consideration of the cause of humanity may also be taken into account."
Then Byatt proceeded to consider and evaluate the various courses of action, which might provide the answer to the impasse. The first possibility in his opinion was for Britain to organize another full military expedition against Syed Mohamed. Byatt could see good prospects for the success of a fresh military expedition because the overconfident Syed Mohamed had already moved his bases to a radius of some 15 miles from the coast, and his position among the Somali was believed to have been weakened by his high-handed administrative methods. In the event of a well-organized military expedition, a substantial number of disgruntled dervishes would defect to the British side. The second possible course of action was to abandon the Protectorate altogether, but this line of action had already been ruled out on the grounds that Britain's prestige would be impaired. The idea of a fresh military expedition was equally repugnant on account of the expenses involved and the uncertainty of the outcome. In Byatt's opinion there was yet one expedient which might be tried, but would have to be tried without undue delay. This was the maintenance on the coast of a small mobile striking force, which could be used to maintain order by coercion within radius of 50 miles or so of Berbera, and to keep the roads clear. It should consist of a Camel Corps of natives of the country not less than 70 strong. Byatt's proposal was received with reservation in the Colonial Office, for it tended to reverse to a certain extent the policy laid down by the Cabinet after prolonged discussion, that our administration should be confined to the 2 or 3 towns on the coast. Byatt travelled to London in May for defending his proposals. The Colonial Office was finally swayed to Byatt's views, not so much because they appeared sound and practicable, but because the Camel Corps would be cheaper than the cost of garrisoning system in force. The Cabinet endorsed the Camel Corps proposals in June 1912 and suggested its strength to be at 150 instead of the 70 originally proposed. The training of the Camel Corps was completed by the end of the year and, on Byatt's recommendation, the force was put under the command of Richard Caulfield. The latter was considered suitable for the post because of his previous experience in dealing with turbulent political situations in Africa. His military career in Africa started with the Anglo-Boer War of 1899, in which he served as a junior officer. At the end of the war, he joined Baden-Powell's scouts, who were responsible for suppressing what remained of the Boer resistance and for disarming those Africans who had acquired arms during the course of the war. With the return to normality of the South African situation, Caulfield became redundant and was forced to return to England. He found life in England too dull for his liking, for he was a man of an impulsive nature, with a strong craving for adventure. Of his impatience to get out of England, he wrote,
"I think of trying America, Colombia, and Ecuador, or somewhere, where there is always a revolution going there."
His plans to leave for South America were cut short by a Colonial Office appointment in 1905 to British Somaliland as a political officer. He left Somaliland in 1910 because of Britain's decision to reduce its administration to the bare minimum. In November of the same year, Caulfield took up a new job in northern Nigeria but found life there very boring owing to the relative absence of political upheavals. He longed to return to Somaliland, and his wishes were answered when he was appointed to command the newly formed Camel Corps. Richard Caulfield's appointment came at a time when Britain's fortunes in the Protectorate were at their lowest point. The interior was in constant turmoil, the eastern section of the Protectorate was under Sayyid Mohammed's firm grip, and the Europeans on the coast lived in constant fear. Worse still, many of the tribes hitherto friendly to the British administration had become disheartened by Britain's policy of retrenchment and were making efforts to get reconciled with Sayyid Mohammed. This was true in the case of the Warsingeli and Gadwain, long-standing allies of the British. The acting governor Geoffrey Archer went to Lascari and Hayes in June 1912 with a view to ascertaining whether these two tribes still friendly to the British. He found them not only hostile but also at loggerheads with one another. The Camel Corps took the field in December 1912, leaving Berbera with a month's provision, and established a base at Mandera, 42 miles to the south of Berbera. This spot had previously been a favorite target for the Habawinis raiders, and Caulfield was authorized to take punitive action against the culprits provided he continued to remind himself of the fact that
the creation of the Corps does not in any way imply a reversal of the accepted policy of coastal concentration. The fundamental reason for the raising of the Camel Corps is the necessity to keep open the trade routes for caravans visiting the coast, and also to put an end to that constant internal warfare among the friendlies which renders them incapable of resisting aggression from the outside.
Byatt's instructions to Caulfield were clearly contradictory and, therefore, self-defeating. On the one hand, Byatt insisted that the inception of the Camel Corps did not affect the official policy on non-interference in the internal politics of the Somali, but, on the other hand, he assigned the force the duty of restoring law and order within the prescribed area, a goal which, needless to say, could not be achieved without any interference in the internal politics of the tribes involved. That Byatt has confirmed the formation of the Camel Corps actually amounted to a change of the policy of non-interference. Further instructions to Caulfield:
"We must start with a clean plate, taking notice of awarding punishment only in those cases of looting and fighting, which occur henceforth. But the government will reserve the right of interfering and enforcing restitution in any such former cases as it sees fit to take up. The Camel Corps is to be regarded as a striking force which may be used to repress disorder and insist on compliancy with any decision arrived at in Berbera."
What if the Camel Corps was to be threatened by a strong Dervish force? Under such circumstance, the Camel Corps should avoid confrontation and instead retire to the coast. Overall, Caulfield was given an impossible task. How was he to ensure political tranquility within a radius of 50 miles while Sayyid Mohammed's field of operation was not similarly limited? A pattern soon emerged whereby Sayyid Mohammed would attack the pro-British tribes living beyond the area prescribed for the Camel Corps. Putting them into a headlock flight towards the coast, the victims would appeal assistance, but Caulfield was not allowed to venture beyond Mandera. In fact, the policy of having the Camel Corps stationed at Mandera but unable to assist the pro-British tribes being Bohotle or the Ain Valley was something quite perplexing both to the pro-British tribes as well as to the Dervishes. The absurdity of the official policy with regard to the Camel Corps soon became apparent to Bayat, and the latter successfully requested the Colonial Office for authority to extend the area of operation to a radius of 100 miles, thereby covering Bur and Bur as the southernmost limits. Caulfield received the extension of the operational area with great enthusiasm. He wrote,
"I am immensely looking forward to the move, and the eyes of the whole country are upon it. To the natives it is quite an epoch-making affair after the government's sphere of action having been confined to the coast for nearly 3 years.
It is quite evident, therefore, that Caulfield's conception of his assignment, let alone his enthusiasm, did not tell with the restrained instructions issued to him of the official policy."
Towards Dul Madoba, the Battle of Ruuga.
Caulfield was off to a good start. Within a couple of months, he had meted out punishment to those he considered recalcitrant, reopened the caravan routes and rewarded the disgruntled groups. In May 1912, Bayat reported, "It may now be hoped that no further fighting will take place in the Western District for some space of time." The tendency of Bayat to allow Caulfield a free hand, even when it was apparent that he was overstepping the limitations officially imposed on him, was a signal for Caulfield to act in obedience to his well-known temperamental and psychological inclinations, thereby courting disaster. In the middle of June 1912, Caulfield took a step, which clearly demonstrated his growing impatience with the restraints of the official policy. On June 12, Caulfield, then in Bel, received a report to the effect that a large Dervish force was harassing people in the Ain Valley, beyond the prescribed operational zone. In utter disregard of the official policy, Caulfield set out in pursuit of the Dervishes with the intention of attacking them. The governor was forced to warn Richard Caulfield that,
"Though nothing whatsoever unforeseen occurred on this occasion, yet I cannot pass over the incident without drawing your attention to the explicit nature of the instructions conveyed to you from time to time on the subject of confining the Camel Corps operations to the immediate vicinity of Borough with Bur as an extreme limit for occasional patrols."
Archer's reminder to Richard Caulfield to stick to the official policy apparently had no impact on the latter. Only 2 months later, he led the Camel Corps to its destruction at Dul Madobe. On August 8, Caulfield received reports that a big Dervish force was raiding to the south of Borough, as far as Ida Wayne. During the first 5 months following the inception of Camel Corps, the Dervishes had confined their operations to the southernmost parts of the Protectorate, avoiding a head-on collision with the Camel Corporation. The possible explanation would seem to be that Sayyid Mohamed wished to ascertain the real intentions of the British government and the real strength of the Camel Corporation. Some interesting changes did take place within the Dervish movement during this period, the most important being the construction of a new fort at Tolle and the transfer of Sayyid Mohammed's Haroun to that place. Hitherto the Haroun had shifted from one place to another, but by the middle of 1913, it had become an established fact that Tolle had become, more or less, Sayyid Mohammed's permanent headquarters. He moved out occasionally either to inspect the other forts, which were scattered in different parts of the country, or to command expeditions. He always invariably returned to Tolle, where he conducted the bulk of his administrative, religious and diplomatic duties. The governor, who happened to be at Borough, permitted Richard Caulfield to go on a reconnaissance mission and then report to him. Under no circumstances was he to engage the Dervishes. Archer asked Gerald Summers, commanding officer of the 6th Battalion KAR, to accompany the Camel Corporation, the idea being, presumably, that he would restrain Caulfield from taking any rash action. The Camel Corps strength amounted to 3 officers, namely Caulfield, Dunn, and Summer, 51 Camelia, 15 pony men, and 6 volunteers. They were armed with 140 rifles, 8,200 rounds of ammunition and 1 Maxim gun. They were joined on the route by 600 spearmen, 150 horsemen and 2,000 riflemen from pro-British tribes. On the evening of August 8, the Camel Corps camped near Riddowain, and from here, they could see Dervish campfires few miles away. Gerald Summers proposed withdrawal, but Richard Caulfield brushed that idea aside. On the following morning, the Dervishes started to move towards Dul Madoba Hill, with the stock they seized. Caulfield decided to cut the dervish line of retreat, and a fierce exchange of fire erupted between the Camel Corps and the 200 or so dervishes. The pro-British tribes who had volunteered support for the Camel Corps took to their heels on hearing of the first shots. Shortly afterwards the Maxim gun was silenced by rifle fire, and Caulfield was shot dead through the head. After 5 hours of pitched battle the dervishes withdrew, leaving 35 of the Camel Corps dead, 21 wounded and 3 missing. The dervishes too lost 20 men. Summers admitted afterwards that had the dervishes not decided to withdraw when they did, the Camel Corps would have been annihilated, for it had run short of ammunition and the Somali soldiers had started to lose heart. The British regarded the outcome of the Dul Madobe confrontation as a disaster, while the dervishes regarded it as their most outstanding victory lay in the history of their 14-year-old struggle against the British. Archer's immediate concern was to secure reinforcements from Aden to defend Berbera in the event of Sayyid Mohamed deciding to invade the town, which he did not. Both the Colonial Office and the local administration were at one in their view that, whatever might have happened at Dul Madobe, Britain could not allow itself to be thrown out of Somaliland by Sayyid Mohamed. The policy of coastal concentration had, therefore, to be abandoned in favor of the policy of effective occupation, the very policy that Caulfield had advocated and for which he is doomed. Sayyid Mohamed, on the other hand, in his characteristic style crowned the Dul Madobe victory with 2 poems. This first poem was addressed to Caulfield's sister who, Sayyid Mohamed learnt, was about to lead a military expedition to avenge the death of her brother. The second poem was addressed to the dead man himself,